Another Women's Day, another day where we celebrate women, maybe do the usual stories of how women are breaking the glass ceiling and that's about it, perhaps forget it. Not so perhaps this year. Given what is happening globally, the Me Too movement, time is up, whether be it in India where women are now flying fighter jets, a lot is changing. So it's not anymore about just one simple day. But Women's Day does give us an opportunity to talk about certain issues and perhaps where we are going in the future as far as society is concerned, as far as polity is concerned, as far as administration is concerned, and how things are changing. To discuss these changes, we perhaps have the best person who could talk about these things, joined by Shashi Tharoor. Many thanks, sir, for speaking to us here. You know,
thank you, Akash, but the best person to talk about these things ought to have been a woman.
I know.
I'm a poor substitute.
And while I agree with that, but perhaps you could help us understand how the administration, how polity, and since you write such a lot on society, perhaps you could shed light on how and where we are going with these things. So I'd like to start by asking you that every year we have this whole Women's Day thing. This time, of course, if I may quote, it is press for progress. We can't be complacent now or never. There is a strong call to action to press forward on progress of gender parity. So that's the theme apparently this year. But themes aside, and they change every year, do you think that men are going to do anything much as far as women's rights are concerned, or it is women themselves? If that is so, are they doing enough? Or are they still hoping that men would cede space, which might not be happening?
Everything you say is plausible. First of all, the thing about an International Women's Day and the occasion that's brought us together today is precisely that it reduces the entire issue to something leading up to and around one particular day. Whereas every day is Women's Day, every day ought to be Women's Day, because the issues of women are issues of daily life. They're issues that affect every human being every single day of the year. And that's my only worry about this. I'm glad we've got an occasion to focus on it, but the worry is precisely that it leaves the rest of the year as a time you don't need to think about women because you've done your bit during Women's Day. Having said that, you raised a very interesting point. Are women waiting for men to cede space? I would say they're not waiting. Many women activists are out there demanding, clamoring, agitating. But are men willing to concede? I think what you're seeing is a gradual sensitization of menfolk. And certainly some major incidents have contributed to a certain sort of shock of realization. The cases of sexual violence, which probably happened in the past but weren't reported in the same way, have suddenly opened a lot of eyes. A lot of decent people who are saying, my God, this is happening in our society. Where have we gone wrong? Have we just failed to educate boys properly in how to respect women, how to deal with women? What's going on with our society? And that started a useful conversation in many places. The horrors of Nirbhaya, what she went through, the poor girl, certainly opened up the space enormously, certainly resulted in a much tougher law on rape. We've seen other headline-grabbing issues, perhaps less grave. The Varnika Kundu stalking thing has created a major campaign on stalking that I'm supporting myself, that says we really ought to make stalking a non-bailable offense. So you can't have somebody harassing a girl, being out on bail and continuing to stalk, because then she won't have the incentive to go to the police anymore.
Correct.
There are lots of these things that are changing, and it's partly because women are demanding it, partly because men, in responding to media coverage, are beginning to realize there's a real problem.
You
here.
talk about media coverage, and you know the media coverage is also a little stale, I would say. It's become an expected pattern. Oh, now we're going to dig out a few women who have broken the proverbial men glass ceiling. Somebody is doing this and somebody's become a bouncer. And it's usually about women who are in the men's field. International Women's Day should be celebrated in that manner, that they're just doing what men do better, or should we respect what women do so well and we never recognize that?
I think both. I mean, it is remarkable when you have a woman leading a military parade, when you have a woman going off into space, when you have a woman flying a fighter jet. All of these things are unusual enough to be worth commenting upon, because when you bring attention to them, you inspire others to do it, so it no longer becomes such an unusual thing. But it's certainly true, and that's where I agree with you completely, that there are things women do every single day that go completely unappreciated. And that includes the so-called housewife, which is a slightly demeaning term for the kind of people who are building our nation, making the homes, nurturing the children who go on to become the future of our country.
Because I'm just saying is that
their work is not recognized.
A man, a six-pack guy model changing a diaper isn't perhaps going to be that hot for the media. So why is a woman who's doing a bouncer's job so hot? Is it because our perceptions are still?
Well, I think the bouncer's job is particularly because you associate that with big, tough, beefy guys.
Yeah.
And you don't think of a woman as a big, tough, beefy guy, but I suppose anybody who's been bounced by one will tell you if she is or she isn't. I think that's the incongruity that does it, any more than you'd find. If you just did a story about a woman who's become a CEO of a company, that's no longer so unusual. We've had women CEOs for a while. Certainly in the US in the 60s, it was big news when a woman became a prominent doctor. Whereas in India, we've been used to that for 50, 60 years before the Americans. So there's also a cultural difference there. But there are still some professions that we don't expect to see women in. And there are some professions where we have seen women, exceptional women in major positions, but we haven't seen a majority. So for example, we had one of the world's first women heads of government in Indira Gandhi, but today we are 146 in the world in female representation in parliament, because only 11% of parliament is female. And that compares adversely even with Pakistan, which is like 90th in the world, because they have a quota for women, and so they have 20% women in their parliament. So we really need to get our act together across the board. We'll focus on the Indira Gandhi or a handful of other big, successful, recognized women. Today it's Smriti Irani, Nirmala Sitharaman, and Menaka Gandhi. But we won't focus on the fact that sitting around in parliament, there are hardly any women around.
33% reservation, does it do a lot of favor, or can it still be twisted and again become the panchayat system where just women would be representing the menfolk in the house? Or do you think that it will actually bring change?
That's really complicated. First of all, 33% obviously will make a difference, because men will have to find women leaders who are electable and put them there. Right now, very often party candidacies are overwhelmingly dominated by men, and sometimes women are given the unwinnable seats.
Correct.
Just to show they've got some women candidates. So I think it would certainly be fairer for women, but it has two consequences. Number one is, of course, the so-called ghettoization. There will always be a feeling, well, she just got there because of a quota, rather than she got there on her own merit. She defeated a man to get there, kind of thing. And the second risk is precisely the one you mentioned. We've seen it in the panchayats, where women candidates happen to be proxies for their husbands, fathers, brothers. Having said that, I have met many of these women, and two interesting things have happened that people don't give enough credit to. The first is, some of these women, I agree not all, maybe not even a majority, but some of these women actually develop a real taste for the work. They go in as proxies, but they become their own women. By actually being a president of a panchayat, a ward councillor, panchayat member,
Sure.
These are people who suddenly discover people coming to them asking for favors. They think about what this means, and their reaction may not necessarily be the one dictated to them by their husband. So there is a process of empowerment taking place for some of those who've come in on this proxy basis.
Okay.
Secondly, there are some women who get in on their own right because there is a quota in the panchayats, and not only because their husbands put them there. And thirdly, there are some women who may come in as proxies, but discover, and their voters discover, they're actually better at it than the people they're proxies for. I've actually seen this in some cases. As an MP, I've dealt with councillors where, when it was a reserved seat for a woman, the guy propped the wife up and he went around with her, but increasingly some of those women were able to shed their husbands and do things themselves, and were on the ball and spot on, efficient, and the voters liked them. So I think tomorrow, if they ran for an unreserved seat, their record during the period of the reserved seat might get them elected. So all of these suggest that reservations, you can't just see them as a one snapshot. It's a moving picture, and it can evolve, and the people who benefit from reservations can gain and change.
Interesting that you said that. I mean, it is of course quite eye-opening that this has happened, and perhaps the representation, or it hasn't been shown in the media as much. Talking about that only, in terms of what can be highlighted and what can be shown as far as women's rights and representation is concerned, I was just watching the Oscars, and perhaps for once the awards were a sideshow and the opening lines were so powerful, the acceptance speeches were so powerful. You had an entire award show that talked about Me Too, Time is Up, race, inclusion. Do you think that the media, arts, culture is doing a good job at this point of time, or needs to do a lot more in educating and making us aware about women's rights?
Our media has a long way to go. I think that in the international media space, certainly this Me Too movement and so on, which is purely a Western thing initially, but which has echoes here and elsewhere, has gone very far. In India, too much of our media, particularly our visual media, is still very voyeuristic, very wedded to TRPs, the breaking news culture. They don't care whom they break in the process, but they're breaking news every second. They're really into sensationalism and voyeurism in a very, frankly, contemptible way for the most part. So they are therefore less good at setting the agenda. Now, where an important issue happens to coincide with their sensationalistic biases,
correct,
then that's great. So the Nirbhaya story fed both their normal interest in prurient subjects like sexual activity, in this case it was sexual violence, and at the same time was important for the social conscience of Indians, and therefore there was a meeting of minds. But half the stories, I mean, somebody was talking about some of the horrors of our media priorities when important things are happening in our country, and how they get distracted by stories like the price of Rahul Gandhi's Burberry jacket or whatever, which dominates the news, when far more important things are happening in this country to women and girls.
Okay. What would you see in India, since we're now going to talk about more about India and not what happened in the Oscars, in terms of women being restrained? Is it more of internal factors within the house, conservative parents, relatives, or external factors, whether be it workplace harassment, whether be it walking down a street? What prevents women from being visible more, heard more, acting more?
All of the above. Certainly there are household constraints. Sometimes, by the way, women themselves are the biggest constraint. That is, mothers-in-law sit down on the heads of their daughters-in-law. The tyranny of expectation, cultural expectation, social expectation, biological expectation. You produce children, you rear them, that's your focus, don't get out of hand. I've heard too many sad stories of bright young students, particularly from certain communities, being pulled out of school early once they get to puberty, because the parents don't want them going out to school. We've got cases of kids who really were fascinated by the learning process in school, but being dragged back for sibling care duties, domestic chores, and of course early marriages. We've raised the legal marriage age to 18, but I'm sorry to say in many parts of the country that is honored in the breach. And it's really sad, because we are depriving our society of the potential these girls will never be able to fulfill, because we never gave them a chance to study, to discover for themselves what their talents and abilities are. We pull them out at 12, 13, 14, marry them off at 15, 16, and they no longer have an opportunity to blossom till a reasonable age, when they could have discovered what their talents were and what contributions they could make to our society. So all of these things are from the domestic constraints. Then the outside world. We've talked about how even in political parties, men tend to get the tickets. We know in the employment market, very often an employer will think, I believe unfairly, that a woman is a riskier hire because she might go off and get married, or she might have children, and then she'll need maternity leave, and you'll have to pay her salary and she won't be producing. So other things being equal, let's go for a guy. Which means a woman has got to be that much better than every available applicant in order to get the job ahead of the applicant, unless the employer is an enlightened person. So all of these things create problems for women.
What would your advice be to such people who are going out for the very first time, have broken the shackles of home, taken employment perhaps for the first time, looking out for the first time, building a career for the very first time, that they stay on and they don't drop out? It's
a tough one to answer, and let me say why. The first thing is that I have seen too many brilliant, successful women who basically gave up their personal life in order to focus on their professions. Those women did well professionally, but it's startling, for example, even take the Indian Foreign Service. If you look at, say, 25 Indian women who made it to ambassador, you'll find about 19, 20 of them were never married. And, you know, it's sad, but they early on decided that, that a marriage and a fulfilling home life would be incompatible with their ambitions to rise to the top of the Foreign Service. It's a shame when these things happen, but it has happened. So I think a young girl should initially say to an employer, I'm going to be better than any guy you could hire in my place. Give me a chance. If he says, well, you might go off and get married, he may not say it, but he may think it, you can say, I've got no plans at the moment. I'm not ruling anything out. I'm not ruling anything in, but I promise you, you hire me, you're going to get the best of me. Demonstrate your worth. I would be personally the kind of employer who, if I were to see an extremely capable woman doing a good job, I would take a 9-month absence or a year's absence or a 6-month absence, whatever it is that the situation permits, as a price worth paying to get an extremely competent employee back. But I recognize not every employer, particularly small and medium employers with tight margins, may find that difficult. And girls will sometimes have to make some tough choices in that process. As far as the workplace is concerned, do we have a supporting environment? I think in some places we do. Oddly enough, I'm told the newsrooms of India, even though I've been critical of them, are actually a pretty healthy environment where it's always assumed not only that women can pull their weight, but very often that they are more sought after by viewers than the men, and therefore they are more prized as employees than men. And therefore the newsrooms of India are great environments for women. It may not be true in a conventional commercial firm. So these are the kinds of things. I would say the most important thing for a girl to do is to follow her bliss. If her bliss is to get a good job with a good salary, make her own calls, choose her own place of residence, lead her own life, and there's some prices worth paying, then she'll have to pay something of a price perhaps in her personal life to do that, and then she will find someone in her personal life who respects that. On the other hand, if she believes that personal fulfillment is as important to her as professional, she may make certain compromises professionally in order to attend to that. Ultimately, the thing is, let the girl decide. Let the woman decide. Let her choose for herself.
But how does she decide when she sees crime climbing on a daily basis? I was just crunching some numbers. Last 15 years, the figures that we have is that crime rates have only doubled, as a matter of fact.
I think some of that is exaggerated very seriously, because I believe that in the past there was a pretty dismal practice of not recording. First of all, women often wouldn't report sexual assault and that kind of crime because it was seen as shameful. It would embarrass the family. People say, just take your lumps. We will forget about it. Don't talk about it. No one will marry you if it's known that you were raped, etc., etc. Secondly, when women had the courage to report it, very often, particularly in our rural and small town parts of northern India, police often didn't record these complaints. They say, let it be. Why do you want to do this? You'll spoil this young man's life. Go off, forget about it. This kind of thing was very, very often talked about. I've heard this from women. And so in the old days, and of course media didn't always report these things. In the old days, therefore, there was a certain degree of under-reporting in the statistics. Recently, the statistics have gone up because the media is much more open about reporting it. People are therefore more willing to talk about it. Society has moved on a bit and can accept that this is not the girl's fault, the woman's fault. She's been a victim and we need to stand by her. And that means that more of these things are being counted. So I'm not excusing the criminals, don't get me wrong. The numbers are worrying and are bad, but it's not as bad as the seeming doubling in 15 years would suggest.
You talk about the old days. Now, speaking as a historian, and let's go back because it's all about finding our roots and our ancient culture. So is it that we are more patriarchal now, or were we always like this? And I'm saying minus the last 50, 100, 200 years. Have women got it worse off in the last few hundred years? Or does the Indian society always, I mean, your research, your study,
well, there's evidence.
Where does it peg women? The goddesses, literally, or it's more of mythology that?
There's evidence on both sides of the argument. I mean, you look at going way back into the Rig Veda, okay, so they're 3,500 years ago from now, of the various seers, the rishis and rishikas, 22 were women, okay, so Gargi and Maitreyi and so on, Ghosha. These are all women who were treated on a par with men as conveyors of the received wisdom, the mantra drashtas.
Without the reservations.
Without the reservations. So there's already, that far back, respect being given to women. There's so many examples. 1,000 years ago, we have Adi Shankara engaging in a famous dispute with his theological or spiritual rival Madana Mishra. And the deal was that he would get to appoint the judge between them. And he chooses this very, very learned woman who happens to be Madana Mishra's wife. And Adi Shankara chooses her to be the judge in their debate. This kind of thing. So there's even in our religious practices and anecdotes and traditions, women have an honored and respected place. But of course, you get the blood-curdling misogyny of the Manusmriti and places like that as well. So there's evidence on both sides. My perception is that every time, every era has been both women-friendly and women-unfriendly in different ways and different aspects. And our era, at least is enabling us to face up and talk about these things. You know, one perception about India has been that most women are relegated to a role of just being either a wife, a daughter, or a mother, and that they have no autonomy beyond that. That, I think, is now changing. However, if today you're willing and able to see a woman as a cabinet minister or a prime minister, a woman as a pilot, as an officer, a woman as a senior executive, a boss, if you see women in all these positions as role models, then it's very difficult to relegate them to the role of just being a wife or a mother. Even then, saying just being is not fair, because of course a strong woman in a homemaking situation often has a profound impact on the men she's with, the husband, the sons. They grow up very, very much under the influence of the strong women in their household, and that too should not be underestimated.
Fair enough. So, you know, that's of course a gradual societal change also, and sometimes you just have to inject some sort of hard action as far as the government is concerned, as far as the administration is concerned. What would you say to what can be rooted out as a social evil or a legal evil? I've just listed down a few things. Tell me, what would it be? What could be our abolition of sati of our times, which is possible now in a realistic manner? Total abolition of child marriage, total representation of women in parliament immediately, total abolition of sex tests, total abolition of dowry deaths, and definitely abolition of child trafficking. Technically illegal, but very much prevalent.
All of the above. I mean, actually, 2 or 3 things you mentioned are already against the law. Sex tests are against the law, child trafficking is against the law, and so on. But sadly, these things go on. So all of those things would be, if you like, today's equivalent of abolishing sati. But we need positive things as well. We need today's equivalent of widow remarriage, where people like Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar stood up and said, it is wrong that children are married off, often to much older men, become widowed at a young age and their lives are over. Why can't they remarry? Create social awakening and consciousness. Look, I grew up in a household with 3 strong women. I have a tough, strong mother and 2 strong sisters. And that made me a feminist, I think, in many ways. I think we need to be able to create a social awakening in our society where people basically grow up and say, hey, we need to realize that women have every single one of the same rights as we do. In fact, our constitution guarantees it to them, our society doesn't.
Who is going to do this? Are you saying that this social awakening has to come from social reformers, or will it come from politicians?
And it comes from you too. It comes from you guys in the public space, in the media, in the public discourse. It certainly has to involve politicians because they can get to certain. I'm sorry to say that our politicians have not painted a very pretty picture of themselves in terms of the kinds of things they've been saying in Parliament on everything from what girls wear to their using mobile phones to their going out after dark, and all these things that these old-fashioned male politicians have been saying have been an embarrassment. But at the same time, you know, a more educated generation of politicians is coming into Parliament. I think they will learn to speak the kind of language that you and I have been speaking today, and give them space. Don't just give space to the troglodytes. Let's give space to those who are thinking openly, progressively, and in 21st century terms.
while the situation, just going back to that very critical point of how women are now speaking out, and Me Too is there, and people are reporting workplace harassment also, do you think sexual violence against women is more of a concern now than it was? Or again, it's the question of just being reported, or they're being objectified and being abused is a lot more?
You know, frankly, I think there were years, certainly when I was growing up in India, where the word rape couldn't be mentioned in a newspaper headline, was considered impolite. So there's no question there's much more public talk about these things. Now, it's no longer being brushed under the carpet. Now, my thing is, it may be that it's just no more frequent than it used to be, but it's just that it's much more open than it used to be. People are talking about it. So I would say yes, all power to the media for raising these issues. Let's raise them in a constructive way. There's been media campaigns on issues of rape, as I mentioned, a current campaign going on stalking. There are a number of themes that our media can take up to increase public awareness and social awareness.
Why I'm asking this is because the scourge of child abuse is also on the rise, or has it also again been a very silent issue that is now being talked about? The availability of pornography to a vast section of people, uncontrolled, unhindered, unchecked. Nobody's talking about banning it. But what would you say to this, this whole wave of the internet coming in? Obviously, it has some negative impact as well.
Well, this is a very tough one. There are many people who are in favor of banning it. And one of the reasons they argue is that these images go and sort of pollute the minds of people who then commit crimes they might not otherwise be prompted to commit. I think we need some serious study of that, because if that's true, we should ban it. But there are others who claim, no, on the contrary, pornography is harmless because it gives these people an outlet for their fantasies and fears and anxieties. They see and experience things on the internet that they would never be able to do in their real life, and that sublimates their passions, and they no longer want to do anything bad.
Correct.
So I need to have verifiable research evidence telling me which set of data is more accurate. Is it an escape valve on the pressure cooker, in which case you should of course have the escape valve there? Or is it actually a pressure cooker that's generating inside the head of some repressed individual who's about to explode, in which case we should take away the pressure cooker and turn off the flame? But I need to know. I mean, I am not instinctively in favor of banning anything. I've always been this sort of notorious liberal in our political space. So you won't catch me ready to ban, but I'm not going to condemn those who want to ban pornography until we see what the evidence is. Maybe they're right, and if they're right, we should ban it.
Absolutely. And of course, the issue of regulation should also be there. Because
well, you can't really regulate something that isn't terribly legal in the first place. I think it's already against the law in India to produce or distribute pornography. So in theory, you can receive a WhatsApp clip from a friend abroad of pornography, and that's legal. But you can't distribute it again to somebody else. But who's policing that? Correct. So regulating how? I mean, this is a regulation. It's violated all the time.
all right. So anyways, so that's a lot of serious questions. Now to end, of course, this discussion, a little bit of non-serious, as if you say, why so serious? I'm going to throw up some words at you. This is, of course, all related to Women's Day and women. Your challenge is to give us your thoughts as succinctly as possible and perhaps as poignantly as possible.
Ooh, that is not funny anymore.
No, it's good fun. It's good fun. Shall I shoot? Okay. What does Shashi Tharoor think about the following, in as short as possible? Women's Day.
I think every day is Women's Day.
Girl power.
I think of most girls I know as being very powerful.
Respect.
I think everybody, man or woman, is entitled to respect, but very often girls are denied the respect they deserve merely because of the way they look, the way they dress, the way they speak, and that is wrong.
Beautiful.
Well, I think we all have a weakness for beauty. I enjoy what is beautiful just as much as the next person, but it can be a beautiful sunset as much as a beautiful woman.
33% reservation.
I think it's the right thing to do. I think until we have demonstrated the capacity to give at least a third of the candidacies in our politics to women without being ordered to do so by law, we have no choice but to pass such a law.
Birth control.
I think that should be the right of every woman to decide whether she wants to have a child when she wants to have the child, how often she wants to have children. Birth control should be something that every woman is empowered to use.
A patriarchal society.
I think the patriarchs are the ones who are causing the biggest problems very, very often. I think that we could do much, much better if we turned around, as in my Nair community, to a much more matriarchal society.
This dress is too short.
Yeah, it's a common comment one hears. Mind you, you can also have very, very long dresses that reveal perhaps much more than a short dress might. So I think it's foolish. In any case, who's saying it? I'd leave it to the girl to decide what's too short for her or too long for her.
Gender equality.
Goes without saying. I think men are actually lucky that all women are demanding is equality. In so many respects, they're superior to us. They have all the intellectual attainments we have. They have all the talents we have, and they can do things we can't, like produce and nurture babies. Why do they only want equality?
Feminism.
I think every single modern person ought to be a feminist, irrespective of gender. It simply means respecting that women are in every way the equal of men. ...
Despite being a woman.
I know who said that. You know, I think that the Prime Minister would probably defend himself saying he didn't mean it that way, but it sounded pretty awful. And to say, for example, which is the context in which he said it, that Sheikh Hasina's tough on terrorism despite being a woman, I would say women are actually far more tough on terrorism and men are the terrorists for the most part. So despite being a man, Mr. Modi, you can be tough on terrorism, even though most terrorists are men.
Romeo Squad.
Stupidity, stupidity. I would stand up for Juliet.
Night curfew.
This is unfair because I've actually found many girls in college hostels writing to me saying, why is it we have to be back by 6 p.m. and the boys can be out till 9:30? It gives them 3.5 hours more to attend a seminar outside the campus, to go and get educational resources or just have fun. Why shouldn't girls have the same opportunity? I don't understand it. But unfortunately, every time I've attempted to support them to change this night curfew rule, I've been shot down by, in one case, a woman principal saying, sorry, this is what the parents want. The fight is not with me or with the college administration, it's with the girls' parents. So parents, wake up, be fair to your daughters.
Objectify.
Looking at people as objects is a big human failing that has been accentuated by our modern media, advertising. The lens has somehow objectified people, and very often it's objectified women more than men.
Nirbhaya.
A great tragedy. What little I know about her, she was an amazingly exceptional, courageous woman who was breaking free from the social and economic circumstances of her family to create a career for herself, was making her own choices. Women like her are the hope of our future, and it was a bigger crime that this happened to her than most of the crimes that we get reported in our papers every day.
Being woke, if you are in with the lingo these days.
In with the lingo, yeah. Well, you know, I'd like to think I'm woke, but I'm not sure I am.
This is a man's job.
Ain't no such thing. Maybe cleaning sewers.
Girls can't drive.
Saudis are talking to you. No, of course girls can drive. In fact, very often girls are more responsible drivers than men.
Okay, finally, last one. Sexy.
No harm in saying it, thinking it, but not restricting yourself just to it. A human being is always much more than their sex appeal, irrespective of gender, I might add. But yeah, I mean, you know, there are some people who are pretty sexy.
Shashi Tharoor, it's a pleasure speaking to you, and I honestly hope that all these things, these inputs, this inspiration is taken forward. Pleasure speaking to you, sir.
Nice talking to you too. Take care. Happy Women's Day.
Thank you.